The first thing Dorian Vex felt was a stranger's memory shattering his skull from the inside. He was lying in an iron cage at the bottom of a wagon. The wheels clattered along the boardwalk. It smelled of rotten water and rust. He didn't know who he was. 6 seconds later, he knew too much. He was 18. He was the third son of the Vex family. His name was Dorian. Yesterday, at the family court, he had been found guilty of stealing the heart of Ash. The sentence was handed down in 11 minutes. Lifelong exile to the Nine-Breath Swamp. Dorian opened his eyes and looked at his hands. Thin, pale, broken nails. The mark of an exile was branded onto his left wrist, 3 stripes and a circle. It wasn't his hand. Now it was his. He tried to remember what had happened before the cart and stumbled upon a void as smooth as glass. No childhood, no home, nothing. Only the memory of Dorian Vex, which poured into him like water into a hold. He sat up. The cell was 2 steps long. 4 others sat nearby. All bore the same brands. An old man was coughing up blood into a rag. 2 young men stared at the floor. The fourth had been dead for about 3 hours, and no one had noticed except Dorian. The coachman didn't even turn around. Dorian looked outside through the bars. The causeway ran over black water. Dead, barkless trees stood on either side. A yellow mist hung between them. It moved against the wind. Dorian looked at the mist and realized he was looking at his own death. In Dorian Vex's memory was a number, the 9-breath quagmire. The average lifespan of an exile there was 11 days. Of the 4,000 sent there over the past 40 years, 7 had returned. All 7 had gone mad. It got its name because, without protection, a person can take exactly 9 breaths in its mist before their lungs begin to rot. Dorian gripped the bars. He had no intention of dying in 11 days. He had no intention of dying at all. He tried to figure out why he was so sure, but he couldn't. There was simply something hard and cold inside him that the old Dorian Vex had never had. The old Dorian had cried at his trial. The old Dorian had begged his father to believe him. The old Dorian had died last night of a broken heart when he realized no one would believe him. The new Dorian sat in his body and counted. The cart came to a stop. The coachman opened the cage and ordered everyone to get out. The old man couldn't stand up. The coachman dragged him out by the leg and threw him onto the pier. The 2 young men got out on their own. Dorian was the last to step out. They left the dead man untouched. The coachman said that the dead were left in the carriage because they were paid by weight on the return trip. Then he pointed north. That's where the pier ended. Beyond that lay only yellow fog. The coachman said that they were being waited for there, and that if they walked back along the pier, archers from the tower would kill them. Then he turned the wagon around and drove off. Dorian stood on the causeway and stared at the fog. One of the young men began to pray. The second sat down on the planks and buried his face in his hands. The old man lay there, coughing. Dorian walked forward. The young man who had been praying shouted at him that he was crazy. Dorian didn't answer. He took his first step into the fog. And that's when everything went wrong. The first breath. Dorian expected his lungs to catch fire. He braced himself for the pain. There was no pain. Instead, something clicked in his head. Quiet and dry, like a lock. The second breath. A line unfolded before Dorian's eyes. It hung in the air and wasn't in the air at the same time. He saw it and knew that no one but him could see it. The line said, "Carrier identified. The selector's talent is activated." Dorian froze in the midst of the fog. Third breath. The line changed. The selector's talent allows the living to be joined with the living. The host can cross a plant with a creature. The result inherits the properties of both parents. Restriction. A seed is required. A sample is required. The carrier's consent is required. Dorian read this twice, then once more. Fourth breath, fifth, sixth. He was still breathing. He raised his hand and looked at it. His skin looked normal. He took a deeper breath on purpose. The fog entered him and flowed right back out. Nothing happened. Dorian turned around. Through the yellow haze, he saw a silhouette on the porch, a young man sitting there. He, too, stepped into the mist. He took 4 steps. On the 5th, he stopped. On the 6th, he fell to his knees. On the 7th, black foam came out of his mouth. On the 8th, he collapsed onto his side. There was no 9th step. Dorian watched this intently. Then he looked at his hands again. He had already taken 12 breaths. He didn't understand why. The line didn't explain it. The line just hung there and waited. Dorian walked further into the fog. After 40 steps, he found the first one. It was a bush. It grew straight out of the black water and was the only living thing within 100 steps. Its leaves were narrow and gray. A yellow film from the fog settled on them and dripped down in droplets. Dorian crouched down beside it. The line flickered. Sample identified. Bog ash. Property. Absorbs poison from the air. Absorption rate is negligible. Radius of effect, 11 centimeters. Dorian looked at the line. 11 centimeters. The bush purified the air around itself to the length of a palm. Useless. Absolutely useless. He plucked a single leaf and rubbed it between his fingers. It smelled of iron. A memory surfaced in Dorian Vex's mind. Marsh ash? A weed. It has no medicinal or alchemical value. It's considered an indicator of dead soil. Dorian got up and kept walking. After 200 steps, the fog thickened so much that he could no longer see his feet. He walked by the sound of water. Then he heard something else. A crunch. Something large was moving to his right. Dorian stopped. It emerged from the fog. It was the size of a calf. 6 legs. A shell like wet stone. Tubes grew from its back, and that same yellow vapor was coming from the tubes. It was the source. It wasn't the fog that was poisoning the swamp. These creatures were exhaling the fog. A line flashed. Sample identified. 6-legged Yadavar. Threat level, medium. Trait. Produces swamp venom in the glands on its back. High concentration. The Yadavar turned its head toward him. It had no eyes, just 2 sockets. It drew in a breath and the tubes on its back swelled. Dorian knew what was coming. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run, and he knew it. The venom eater exhaled. A jet of yellow vapor engulfed Dorian completely. He stood inside it for 3 seconds. Then the vapor dissipated. Dorian was still standing. He looked at his hands. His skin was fine. The venom eater tilted its head. It exhaled again. Dorian was standing there again. On the 4th exhale, the creature began to back away. Dorian watched it, and a thought slowly took shape in his mind. He didn't understand why the poison wasn't affecting him. But he knew this was his only chance. He stepped toward the Yadavar. The creature struck him with the side of its shell and knocked him off his feet. Dorian fell into the black water. He got back up. His eyebrow was split open and bleeding. The shell hurt. The shell could kill him. The poison couldn't. Dorian took a step back and kept his eyes fixed on the creature. He picked up a piece of dry root from the water and held it like a stick. The poisoner advanced on him. Dorian struck it on the tube on its back. The tube cracked. The creature roared, and steam poured from the crack straight into its face. It twitched. Dorian struck it again, then once more. He struck the same spot 41 times. He was counting. On the 41st strike, the tube burst completely, and the poison bearer collapsed into the water and didn't move anymore. Dorian stood over it, breathing heavily. Not from the poison, from exhaustion. The line appeared again. Sample available. Gland of the 6-legged poisoner. Dorian looked at the dead creature. Then, back to where he'd come from. The bush. The marsh ash. It absorbs poison to the length of a palm. He returned. It took him half an hour, and he lost his way twice. The bush was still there. Dorian crouched down next to it. He was holding a piece of the poisoner's gland in his hands, a wet, yellow sac that burned his palm. He didn't know what to do next. The line was waiting. Dorian recalled the conditions. A seed is required. A sample is required. The carrier's consent was required. He looked at the bush. There were 4 small gray spheres on it. Seeds. Dorian plucked one. He held the seed in his right hand, the gland in his left. He brought his hands together. The line flashed brighter than before. A request for crossbreeding, the swamp ash and the 6-legged poisoner. Hereditary trait of the former. Poison absorption. Heritable trait of the second. Gland volume and metabolic rate. Confirm. Dorian didn't hesitate for a second. He confirmed. The seed in his hand twitched. It grew so hot that his skin sizzled. Dorian didn't unclench his fingers. The seed grew right in the palm of his hand. It swelled to the size of a fist, and its shell turned grayish-yellow, with tubes becoming visible on its surface. The message appeared. Crossbreeding complete. Species created. Poison ash. Trait. Absorbs swamp poison from the air. Radius of effect, 3 meters. Absorption rate, high. Dorian stared at the seed in his palm. 11 centimeters. 3 meters. He counted in his head. The radius had increased nearly 28-fold. He dropped to his knees and pressed the seed into the black mud. Nothing happened. He waited. He waited 8 minutes. Then the mud cracked. A sprout emerged from it. It grew quickly. A minute later, it was a knee-high bush. 3 minutes later, it was taller than Dorian. Its leaves were broad and gray. No film settled on them. They drew it in. Dorian looked up. Above and around him, the fog was thinning. It receded from the bush like water from a rock. 10 minutes later, there was a clear patch around Dorian, 3 meters in radius. Dorian walked north for 6 hours. He planted 5 of the 9 seeds in the mud. He kept 4 in his fist. He didn't know what lay ahead and didn't want to arrive there empty-handed. The trail behind him had already begun to take shape. He looked back twice and saw the same thing both times. Behind him, in the fog, sparse patches of light hung where the bushes rose. They looked like holes burned through a dirty piece of cloth. Dorian counted the steps between them and realized he'd miscalculated. A 3-meter radius meant 6 meters of clear passage. But he'd been leaving 200 steps between each gap. The gaps didn't connect. This wasn't a trail. It was a chain of islands. He stopped and committed this to memory. 200 steps was too many. He needed 40. He moved on, and this time counted more precisely. By evening, the fog had changed. It was no longer yellow, but had turned brown. Dorian took a breath and, for the first time all day, felt something. Not pain. Pressure. As if a hand had been placed on his chest. The line appeared on its own. Zone defined. Inner quagmire. The concentration of poison is 19 times higher than outside. Dorian stopped. He took another deliberate, deep breath. The pressure remained. He wasn't dying. But for the first time, he sensed a boundary, and that put him on guard. So his immunity wasn't infinite. That meant there was a concentration somewhere that would get to him. He didn't know where that limit was. He only knew that it existed. He moved on more slowly. An hour later, he heard voices. Dorian lay down in the mud and crawled forward. Ahead, in the brown mist, a fire was burning. He crawled 40 paces closer and saw it. It was a pile. A single enormous pile driven into the quagmire, with a platform of planks resting on top of it. On the platform, a bonfire burned in an iron bowl. People were sitting around the fire. Dorian counted 11 of them. They were strange. Their skin was gray with a greenish tinge. They had growths on their shoulders and necks, like tree bark. One of them had a branch with fingers in place of his left hand. They breathed the swamp air and did not die. Dorian Vex's memory provided the answer immediately. Swamp dwellers. Descendants of the first exiles. 400 years in the swamp. The poison hadn't killed them. It had transformed them. In houses like the Vexes, they were called rot and weren't considered human. There was no punishment for killing a swamp dweller. Dorian looked at them and thought of something else entirely. They had survived. 400 years in this air. So they had something he didn't. He rose from the mud to his full height. 11 heads turned toward him at once. One of them stood up. He was a head taller than the rest, and his chest was covered in bark instead of skin. He raised his hand, and the others froze. He asked who had come. Dorian replied that his name was Dorian, and that he had been exiled 3 days ago. The swamp dweller asked how long he'd been walking through the quagmire. Dorian said 6 hours. The swamp dweller looked at him in silence. Then he asked why he was still breathing. Dorian didn't answer. The swamp man climbed down from the platform using a rope and stood before him. He smelled of wet wood. He was 2 heads taller, and his arms were thicker than Dorian's leg. He said his name was Gruel. He said that the new exiles arrived here dead, carried by the current. He said that none had ever made it here alive. Then he grabbed Dorian by the throat and lifted him out of the water. Dorian didn't resist. He looked Gruel in the eyes and didn't look away. Gruel held him for 20 seconds. Then he let him go. He said Dorian's skin was clear. Not a single blemish. Not a single growth. He said that didn't happen. People from up above get covered in sores within an hour in the quagmire. Dorian said he knew. Gruel asked who he was. Dorian said he didn't know, and that was the truth. Gruel was silent for a long time. Then he said it wasn't up to him to decide. He led Dorian further north. They walked another 2 hours along a causeway made of bones. Dorian watched his step and realized this wasn't a metaphor. The causeway was paved with spines. Thousands of vertebrae driven into the mud and bound together by tendons. Gruel said this road was built on the backs of exiles. He said this without malice. Just a fact. The settlement opened up in the fog all at once, in its entirety. Dorian stopped for a second. It was enormous. Hundreds of piles stretched into the brown murk. Platforms connected by bridges stood on them. Rope ladders hung between the platforms. Beneath it all lay black water. Dorian counted more than 200 platforms and stopped counting. He asked how many people were here. Gruel said there used to be 9,000. Dorian asked what used to be meant. Gruel didn't answer. They climbed onto the central platform. It was wider than the others, and there were no fires on it. Only a tent made of animal hides. 2 men with bone spears stood at the entrance. Gruel said the chief would receive him now because the chief already knew. Dorian asked how he knew. Gruel said the chief always knew. Inside the tent, it was dark and hot. In the center, on a bed of moss, sat an old man. He was completely covered in bark. He had no human skin left at all. Only his eyes were alive. He said his name was Branch. He said he had been the chief of the swamp tribes for 61 years. He said Dorian smelled wrong. Dorian asked what he meant. Branch said he smelled like clean water, and there was no clean water in the swamp. He asked what Dorian had brought. Dorian didn't lie. He opened his fist and showed him 4 seeds. Branch leaned forward and looked at them for a long time. Then he said they were ash plant seeds. He said the ash plant was a weed that did nothing. Dorian said this one did. Branch asked, "What?" Dorian said that this one clears the fog for 3 meters. It grew quiet in the tent. Gruel, standing at the entrance, held his breath. Branch looked at Dorian, his bark-like face unchanging. Then he said one word. "Show me." They went outside. Dorian climbed down the stairs from the platform and stood knee-deep in the mud. Swamp dwellers were gathering around him on the bridges. There were already hundreds of them. They looked down in silence. Dorian crouched down and pressed the seed into the mud. Then he straightened up and waited. For 8 minutes, nothing happened. Someone on the bridge laughed. The laughter spread. Gruel shouted for them to be quiet. The laughter didn't stop. Dorian stood in the mud, staring intently at the ground. In the 9th minute, the mud cracked. The laughter stopped. The sprout began to grow upward. It was thicker than the first one because the mud here was richer. 2 minutes later, it was taller than Dorian. 4 minutes later, its leaves unfurled, and they were as wide as the palm of a hand. The brown mist around it began to tremble. It started to be drawn into the leaves. You could see it happening.
It flowed toward the bush in streams like smoke up a chimney. A circle of fresh air opened up around Dorian, and it grew bright inside it. Not because the sun had come out, but because for the first time in 400 years, one could see farther than an outstretched arm here. The swamp dwellers on the bridges didn't move, not a single one. Then one of them jumped down.
He fell into the mud next to the bush, stood up, and took a breath. He took a deep breath. He took another. Then he screamed. Dorian tensed, but it wasn't a cry of pain. The swamp dweller was screaming, gasping for air, laughing, and screaming again. He was calling to the others. A second one jumped after him. Then a third. Then they poured off the bridges like peas. A minute later, 40 people were standing in a perfect circle around the bush, all of them breathing, and none of them could stop. Dorian took a step back so he wouldn't be knocked over. He stared at them intently, and something in his face flinched once. Then he became calm again. The branch came down last. He walked slowly, and his bark creaked. It entered the circle and stopped. It raised its head and took a breath. Then it raised its arms and looked at them. He said he hadn't breathed like that since he was 7. He said he'd forgotten what it was like. He turned to Dorian, and in his eyes was something Dorian hadn't expected. Not gratitude. Calculation. Branch asked how many of those seeds he had. Dorian said 3. Branch asked how many he could produce. Dorian said that each bush yields 9 seeds a week. Branch fell silent. He was counting. Dorian watched him calculate and waited. Then Branch asked what Dorian wanted. Dorian said he wanted land. Branch asked what kind. Dorian said any kind. He said he needed a patch of quagmire that nobody wanted and that nobody would touch. Branch asked why. Dorian said he would grow things there. Branch asked what. Dorian said he didn't know yet. Branch looked at him for a long time. Then he said he would give him rot. Gruel turned his head sharply. He said it wasn't allowed. Branch raised his hand, and Gruel fell silent. Branch explained. Rot is a patch 3 hours to the east. The quagmire there isn't brown, it's black. Even swamp dwellers die there within a day. Something happened there 400 years ago, and no one has returned from there since. Branch said that if Dorian wanted land that no one would touch, there was no better place than Rot. He said it matter-of-factly. He was testing him. Dorian realized he was being tested and answered immediately. He said he'd take it. Gruel said he was a dead man. Dorian didn't answer him. He looked at Branch. Branch looked at him. Dorian stared at the gray spot on his arm for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned around and walked back out. He took 14 steps back into the brown mist and stopped. He raised his hand and looked again. The spot had stopped growing. The text had changed. Degradation halted. Tissue regeneration. 11% per hour. Dorian sat right down in the mud and waited. Gruel stood 20 steps away, watching him. He didn't approach. After an hour, the spot had faded by half. After 2 hours, it was gone. Dorian hadn't moved the whole time and had been counting. He figured out 3 things. First, his immunity isn't absolute. He has a threshold. Second, the threshold lies somewhere between the inner quagmire and the rot. Third, he's regenerating. Slowly, but he was recovering. So the question wasn't whether he could enter the rot. The question was how far. He stood up and walked back to the black wall. Gruel asked where he was going. Dorian said he was going to check. He entered the rot and began counting aloud. On the count of 41, the line turned red. At 90, the spot on his hand grew to the size of a coin. Dorian turned around and walked out. He made a mental note. 1.5 minutes. 1.5 minutes inside and an hour outside to recover. It was useless. You can't do anything in 1.5 minutes. Dorian sat down and began to think. Gruel approached and crouched down next to him. He said he'd seen people trying to go in there. He said they went in with their faces covered, holding wet rags and reed pipes. Everyone died. He said that rot doesn't kill through the mouth, it kills through the skin. Dorian looked at him, then at his hand. The mark was on the back of his hand, not in his lungs, on his skin. He understood everything at once. He hadn't been poisoned. It was eating away at him from the outside. That was good. That was very good. Because you can protect yourself from something that comes from the outside. Dorian took out the seeds. 8 were left. He looked at them and realized he needed a different specimen. The poisonous ash tree purified the air. The air here wasn't the problem. The problem was the black suspension itself that settled on the skin. He needed something that wouldn't let it through. Something with a shell. Dorian stood up and told Gruel that he needed a creature with a shell. Gruel asked why. Dorian didn't answer. Gruel said that shelled creatures were found near the eastern shoals and that they were deadly. Dorian said that would do. They headed east along the edge of the rot. Gruel walked behind him, and Dorian could tell he wasn't happy. An hour later, Gruel stopped him and pointed ahead. Mounds jutted out of the black water. Dorian counted 6. Gruel said it was a bottom dweller. He said the creature weighed as much as 3 men, and that its shell was impenetrable to a spear. He said it was deaf and blind but could sense the movement of the water. Dorian asked how it could be dangerous if it was blind. Gruel said it grabs you and holds you underwater until you die. He said 4 of his men had perished that way over the past year. Dorian looked at the mounds. The system responded. Sample identified. Bottom Guardian. High threat level. Trait. Armor impervious to water and air toxins. Armor regenerates upon damage. Dorian read it twice. Impervious. He stepped into the water. Gruel hissed and grabbed him by the shoulder. Dorian shook off his hand and said he had to do this. Gruel said he would die. Dorian said he wouldn't die from the poison. Gruel said not from the poison, but from the water, yes. Dorian waded into the water up to his waist. The mounds didn't move. He took another step. The water reached his chest. The nearest hump stirred. Dorian froze. He stood motionless for 40 seconds. The hump calmed down. Dorian understood the mechanism immediately. The creature senses movement, so he mustn't move. That means something else has to move. He looked toward the shore and saw Gruel. He shouted for him to throw a rock into the water on the right. Gruel understood and threw it. The splash went to the right. All 6 humps turned in that direction at once and moved off. The water churned. Dorian saw the back of the nearest one as it passed within 3 steps of him. Its shell was black and wet, covered in seaweed. Dorian didn't move. When the sentinel passed, he leaped onto its back. The creature exploded beneath him. It lurched downward, and Dorian went underwater. He clung to the seaweed on the shell and held on. The guard lashed out with its tail and thrashed about. Dorian wouldn't let go. The water was black, and he couldn't see a thing. He felt for the edge of the shell near the hind leg. There was a crack there. He stuck his hand in. The creature jerked so hard it nearly tore his shoulder off. He grabbed something soft inside and yanked. The sentinel stopped thrashing. It floated to the surface on its side. Dorian climbed onto its back and vomited black water. In his hand was a piece of meat. The line spoke. Sample available. Armored gland of the bottom sentinel. Dorian crawled ashore and collapsed. Gruel stood over him, silent. Then he said he'd never seen a human go into the water after the sentinels. Dorian said he'd seen it now. He lay there for 10 minutes. Then he sat up. His left arm was dislocated, and he set it himself against a tree without making a sound. Gruel watched this. His bark-like face showed no expression, but he turned away. Dorian took out a seed. He held the seed in his right hand and the gland in his left. The line flashed. Crossbreeding request. Poison ash and bottom watcher. Heritable trait of the first. Poison absorption. Heritable trait of the second. Impenetrable shell. Warning, second-order carrier. Stability reduced. Dorian stopped. Second order. He realized that the poison ash was already a hybrid. He was crossbreeding a hybrid with a new one. He didn't know what would happen. He confirmed. The seed didn't heat up. It turned icy. It burned with cold, and Dorian felt it pulling something out of his hand. The feed said, consumption, host's life force, 11%. Dorian felt his legs give way. He sat down. His vision darkened. He didn't unclench his hand. 8 seconds later, it was all over. The line reported, crossbreeding complete. Species created, swamp armored beetle. Trait, absorbs poison from the air and water. Radius, 2 meters. Forms a shell around the root zone. The shell is impervious to black sludge. Dorian stared at the seed. It was black and hard as a rock. He struggled to his feet. Gruel asked if he was all right. Dorian said he was fine. He was lying. He felt as if a part of him had been torn out. He walked toward the rot. Gruel followed him to the black wall and stopped there. Dorian entered the rot and began to count. On the count of 41, the red arrived. Dorian didn't stop. He kept moving forward. At 90, he felt a burning sensation on the skin of his face. At 120, he fell to one knee. He pressed the seed into the black mud and pushed it deeper with his fingers. Then he turned around and walked back. He didn't run. He walked. At 180, he emerged from the black wall and fell face first into the brown mud. Gruel turned him over. Dorian's face was covered in gray spots. The skin on his left arm was peeling off in patches. The line flashed red. Degradation, 41%. Gruel was shouting something. Dorian couldn't hear him. He stared at the sky and waited. An hour later, the spots on his face faded. 3 hours later, he was able to sit up. 6 hours later, he stood up. He turned toward Nil. Gruel said there was nothing there. Dorian looked. The black wall stood just as it had been. He waited another hour. Nothing. He waited until dark. Nothing. Gruel said the seed had died. He said the black sludge killed everything, and that Dorian had burned himself for nothing. Dorian didn't answer. He sat on the edge and stared intently all night long. At dawn, the black wall shifted. Not much. In one spot, roughly at chest level, a lighter patch appeared. Dorian stood up. The patch grew, it grew slowly. By noon, it was a hole the size of a wagon. Inside the hole, Dorian saw a bush. It was short and thick, and its leaves were black with gray edges. Around its roots, the dirt wasn't black. It was brown. A shell, the line said. A bog armadillo. Age, 1 day. Radius, 2 meters, 11 centimeters. Dorian stepped inside. He took 40 steps toward the hole, and on the count of 41, the red light appeared. He took 8 more steps and entered a clear patch. The red light faded. The line said, "Concentration is normal." Degradation halted. Dorian stood inside rottenness and breathed. Gruel at the edge of the black wall watched this and didn't move. Dorian looked around. Inside the spot, seeds were already forming on the branches of the armored plant. He counted them. 4. Fewer than on the ash plant. But they were there. He plucked them all off. Then he went back out to Gruel. He said it was possible now. Gruel asked what? Dorian said it was now possible to build a road into the rot. He explained the mechanics out loud, and Gruel listened without interrupting. 4 seeds. Each produces a bush with a radius of 2 meters. The bush forms a clear circle within rot. You have to take 41 steps between circles. He can manage 41 steps. He plants the next seed at the border. He waits a day. He moves on. Each bush yields 4 new seeds. Each generation means 40 more steps inward and a 4-fold increase. Gruel asked how long it would take to reach the center. Dorian said he didn't know, because he didn't know where the center was. Gruel said the center was 2 days' journey away. Dorian did the math. 40 steps a day. 2 days' journey is roughly 20,000 steps. 500 days. He said this out loud. Gruel said that was a year and a half. Dorian said he had 12 days. He sat down and stared at the black wall, and something cold and swift was working in his head. Then he looked up and asked Gruel if anything grew in the rottenness itself. Gruel said no. Dorian asked if he was sure. Gruel said that for 400 years, no one had brought anything back from there. Dorian said that for 400 years, no one had even gone in there. He stood up and walked in a clean circle around the armored shell. He sat down there and began to stare at the black mud beyond the shell's border. He stared for 2 hours. Then he saw it. Something stirred in the black mud half a meter from the boundary. Dorian didn't move. It stirred again. A thin white tendril poked out of the mud. It was like a worm, but it was a plant. It had no leaves. It was moving. It was reaching toward the shell of the armored creature. A message flashed. Sample identified. Unknown species. Classification impossible. Property. Feeds on a clean environment. Dorian stared at the white tendril and realized he had found what had killed 6,000 swamp dwellers. Dorian didn't move for 40 minutes. The white outgrowth reached the edge of the shell and stopped. It couldn't get through. It poked at it like a blind finger, crawled back and poked again. Dorian watched this intently. Then he realized something else, and it was bad. The tendril wasn't alone. He peered at the black mud beyond the border and saw ripples. They ran all the way around the circumference. There were hundreds of them. They surrounded the clear circle on all sides, and all were reaching inward. Dorian stood up very slowly. The armor on his back creaked. Dorian turned around. A crack appeared in the bush's trunk. Sap oozed from the crack. He looked at the roots. The shell was holding, but it was thinner than yesterday. The program reported, Marsh armored bush. Shell integrity, 78%. External pressure, source unknown. Dorian calculated quickly. 78% in a single night. That means in 4 days, the bush will be gone. That means these creatures will devour any clean circle he sets up. That means his plan for 500 days was dead even before he came up with it. He stepped out of the circle. On the count of 41, the red arrived. He walked over to Gruel and told him there was something alive in Gnil. Gruel didn't believe him. Dorian said it was white and leafless and that it ate clean air. Gruel fell silent. Then he said one word. White threads. Dorian asked what he knew. Gruel sat down and told his story. 2 years ago, people in the settlement began to die. Not from poison. People simply stopped breathing. Their skin turned white and soft. Inside them, they found threads, thin and white, that had grown through their lungs. The tribe's healer performed autopsies on 11 bodies, and each one showed the same thing. The shaman said it was a curse. The branch said it came from rot. 6,000 had died in 2 years. Dorian asked why they hadn't left. Gruel looked at him and said there was nowhere to go. To the west, the causeway and archers on the tower. To the north, the sea that kills. To the east, rot. He said they'd been trapped there for 400 years. Dorian sat and sorted them. The white threads come from rot. They feed on a pure environment. The swamp dwellers live in polluted air, which means that for the threads, a swamp dweller is a pure environment. So the threads go where it's cleaner. He raised his head. He remembered how 40 swamp dwellers had jumped from the bridges in a circle around the ash pit, breathing and laughing. He had set up a beacon in the settlement. He himself had shown the threads where to go. Dorian stood up so abruptly that Gruel recoiled. He said they had to go back, immediately. Gruel asked why. Dorian said he had planted bait in the settlement. Gruel didn't understand at first. Then he did. He ran ahead. They walked back for 6 hours, neither of them saying a word. The settlement came into view through the fog, and Dorian saw that he was too late. A crowd had gathered around the central platform. The poisonous ashtray was in place. The perfect circle was in place. 11 bodies lay in the mud within the circle. Dorian jumped down and approached them. He crouched down next to the first one. It was a man in his 30s with growths on his shoulders. His skin had turned white and soft. A thread was sticking out of the corner of his mouth. Dorian pulled at it with his fingers. It stretched out 4 palms length and didn't end. He let go. He looked at the bush. The mud was stirring at its roots. Dorian looked closely and saw them. They were there. Hundreds of white tendrils wound around the roots of the ash tree and radiated outward like rays. They had come out into the open air. They found him in a single night. The crowd on the bridges was silent. Then someone shouted that he was the one who had brought them. The cry was taken up. Gruel raised his spear and bellowed, and the crowd fell silent, but not for long. Dorian stood in a circle among 11 bodies and stared at the white threads without looking away. He couldn't. He was thinking. Branch came down the stairs. He walked over and looked at the bodies. Then at Dorian. He asked him if he knew. Dorian said no. Branch asked if he knew now. Dorian said yes. Branch asked what? Dorian said it aloud and loudly so that everyone on the bridges could hear. He said that the threads were heading for purity. He said that for 400 years there had been nothing pure in the quagmire, and that was why the threads had remained in the rot and hadn't come out. He said that 2 years ago something had changed and they had begun to emerge and search. He said that they were finding the purest thing in the quagmire, and that was the swamp dweller's lungs. He said that the swamp dweller breathes poison its whole life, and its body filters out the poison. So the inside of the swamp dweller is purer than the outside. He said that all 6,000 died because they were living filters. It grew very quiet on the bridges. Branch stood there, his bark creaking. Then he asked what to do. Dorian said he didn't know. Branch asked why he was speaking then. Dorian said that at least now they knew what they were dying from. Branch was silent for a long time. Then he said that wasn't enough. Dorian agreed. He said it wasn't enough. Then he said he needed a body. The crowd murmured. Branch raised his hand. He asked why. Dorian said he needed a sample of the thread. Branch asked what he would do with it. Dorian said he would cross it. Branch asked with what. Dorian said he didn't know yet. He said the thread was the best thing he'd seen in the quagmire. The crowd erupted. Someone shouted that he was mad. Someone else said he wanted to cultivate death. Gruel looked at Dorian as if he were a stranger. Dorian didn't raise his voice. He spoke calmly, and that's why they heard him. He said that the thread had passed through the shell of an armored creature that the black sludge couldn't penetrate. He said that the thread had found a clear circle in a single night, traversing kilometers of dead quagmire. He said that the thread grows in the rot, where nothing else grows. He said that the thread is the strongest living thing in this land and that he has no intention of killing it. He intends to take it. The branch looked at him for a very long time. Then he turned to the crowd and said one word: "Give it." The crowd fell silent. No one moved. Then a woman stepped forward. She was young, and the bark covered only the left side of her face. She stood over one of the bodies and said it was her brother. She said that if they could do something with him, they should go ahead. She said he wasn't breathing anyway. She looked at Dorian and didn't take her eyes off him. Dorian nodded to her once. He didn't say thank you. He knew that thank you meant nothing here. He crouched over the body. The line flashed. Sample identified. White thread. Classification impossible. Property 1. Penetration through any organic barrier. Property 2. Search for a clean environment at a distance. Property 3. Assimilation of the host. Dorian read the third property twice. Assimilation. He looked at the body. The thread didn't kill. The thread transformed. He pulled the thread out of the dead man's throat. It went on for a long time. He pulled it out to the length of his arm, and it snapped. At its end was a thickening. A knot. The string said, "Sample received." A knot in the white thread. Dorian stood up straight, the knot in his hand. He looked at the seeds. He had 3 ash plants and 4 armored plants. He thought. To cross the thread with an ash plant means to get a plant that seeks purity and purifies the air. Pointless. Crossing it with an armored plant would mean getting a shell that seeks purity. That's pointless too. He needed something else. He needed what the thread was seeking. He raised his head and looked at the swamp dwellers on the bridges. 3,000 people. Living filters. The purest thing in the quagmire. The thread is heading for them. And then Dorian understood. He mustn't stop the thread from going after the pure. He must give it something purer and more delicious. He must make a decoy. Dorian told Branch that he needed another specimen. Branch asked what kind. Dorian said he needed a swamp dweller. The crowd erupted again. Gruel stepped forward with his spear. Branch didn't move. He asked if it had to be alive or dead. Dorian said he didn't need it alive. He needed lung tissue. Branch asked whose. Dorian pointed to the body of the woman's brother and said it was his. He said that the thread had already passed through him, which meant his lung would work. The woman said, "Take it." She said this without expression. She was staring at the mud. Dorian worked with a bone knife by the light of the fire. He cut open the rib cage and removed a piece of the lung. It was white and contained a network of threads. The string said, "Sample identified, filtrating lung tissue. Property, extracts poison from the air and accumulates it within itself. Efficiency, 91%. Dorian held a piece of the dead lung and an ash tree seed in his hands. The line flashed. Crossbreeding request. Poisonous ash tree and filtering lung tissue. Heritable property of the first. Absorption of poison from the air. Inherited trait of the second. Accumulation and concentration. Warning. Second-order carrier. Stability reduced. Life force consumption, 19%. Dorian looked at the number. 19. Last time it was 11, and he'd nearly lost consciousness. He confirmed it. The seed turned icy. Dorian felt as if something were being pulled out of him by a thick cord. He fell to his knees. Black spots appeared before his eyes. Dorian went out at dawn, and Gruel went with him. He didn't ask any questions. He simply took a spear and stood beside Dorian, and Dorian didn't object. 9 more followed them, all young, all carrying bone spears. Dorian turned to look at them and asked why. One said his mother lay in white. Another said both his brothers had died. A woman with a scar on the left side of her face walked at the rear and said nothing. Dorian nodded and kept walking. They walked for 2 hours toward the southeast. Dorian was choosing a spot. He needed a place far enough from the settlement for the threads to fade away, yet close enough to reach on foot. He stopped on a bare sandbar amid the black water. 2 kilometers from the stilts. Not a single tree. Not a single bush. He pressed a white seed into the mud and stepped back. They waited 20 minutes. Then the mud swelled. The hunting sponge didn't grow like a bush. It grew like a mushroom. A thick, grayish-white stem rose to human height. Then the cap opened. It was 2 steps across, and on the underside it had folds like gills. The folds began to move. They began to pump air. Dorian stepped back even further. The fog around the sponge moved toward it, not slowly, as if toward an ashtray. It surged toward it in a torrent. An area with an 11-meter radius cleared in a minute and a half. The marsh plants behind Dorian rustled. He raised his hand and they fell silent. Then he pointed downward. The mud beneath the sponge's stem was stirring. Dorian crouched down. Threads were emerging from the black water. They were moving toward the stem from all sides. There were so many that the water around the shoal turned white. They climbed onto the stem and wrapped themselves around it. 10 minutes later, the stem was no longer visible. It was white, covered by a solid layer of threads. Gruel raised his spear. Dorian told him not to touch it. Gruel asked why. Dorian said, "Watch." The threads entwined the stem and crept higher. They reached the cap. They burrowed into the folds. The sponge offered no resistance. It continued to pump air. Half an hour later, the entire sponge was encased in a white cocoon and was still functioning. Dorian looked at the readout. A hunting sponge. Integrity, 99%. Load, 0. He didn't understand. He moved closer, crouched down, and examined the threads up close. And then he understood. The threads weren't eating the sponge. They had attached themselves to it and were drinking clean air straight from its folds. They didn't need to assimilate it. It was giving them what they sought of its own free will. It was better than a swamp creature. Dorian straightened up and said aloud that they weren't killers. Gruel asked, "What?" Dorian said that the threads didn't want to kill. He said that a thread enters a swamp creature not to devour it. It enters because it's the only clean place in the quagmire. It crawls inside and stays there and breathes, and the swamp creature dies as a side effect. He said that 6,000 people had died simply because the threads wanted to breathe. The swamp dwellers behind him were silent. The woman with the bark said that didn't make it any easier. Dorian said it wasn't supposed to. He said it made things simpler. He said you can't negotiate with hunger, but you can with a need. They stood on the shallows for 3 hours and watched. The threads kept coming and coming. By noon, the water around the sponge was white for 100 paces. Dorian sent 2 men back to the settlement to check. They returned 4 hours later and said there were no more threads near the ashtray. Not a single one. They were all gone. Gruel sat right down in the mud. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he said that if this had been 2 years ago, Dorian didn't answer. He looked at the cocoon and counted. By evening, a second thing happened. On the sponge's cap, among the threads, fruits began to swell. They were round and dark and hung in clusters. The string said, "Trapping sponge. Fruiting. The fruit contains a concentrate of swamp poison. Purity, 91%. Dorian plucked one. It was heavy and warm, and something sloshed inside. He held it in the palm of his hand, and something clicked into place in his mind. Dorian Vex's memory surfaced all at once and in its entirety. The Vex house dealt in alchemy. Purified poison formed the basis of half the house's recipes. They extracted it from the glands of venomous creatures and purified it through 4 distillations, yielding a final product with 41% purity, considered the finest on the continent. An ounce of it fetched the same price as an ounce of silver. Dorian stared at the fruit in his palm. 91%. No distillations. Just plucked from a branch. He looked at the sponge. About 60 fruits hung from it, and it was still growing. He looked at the marsh around him. It was endless and full of poison, and he could plant 1,000 of these mushrooms here. Dorian stood on the shallows and, for the first time since waking, felt something resembling genuine interest. He clenched the fruit in his fist. The juice trickled between his fingers, and he stared at it intently. Then Gruel said someone was coming. Dorian turned around. People were coming down the boardwalk from the west. There were about 40 of them, and they were marching in formation. Dorian looked more closely. They weren't swamp dwellers. Their skin was normal. They wore breathing masks with tubes and leather cloaks soaked in resin. They carried steel spears. 3 of them had crossbows. Gruel hissed and said one word. Gatherers. Dorian asked who. Gruel said that once a year, masked people come from beyond the causeway. He said they beat the poisoners, cut out their glands, and leave. He said that if a swamp dweller gets in their way, they kill him because they're paid 3 copper coins per swamp dweller's head. He said that last time, they took 19 people. Dorian looked at the group. He looked at the masks and the cloaks. Then he looked at his 11 men with their bone spears. He told everyone to lie down. Everyone lay down except Gruel. Dorian looked up at him. Gruel said that if they saw the sponge, they'd take it. Dorian said they wouldn't. Gruel asked why. Dorian said it wouldn't go. He explained quickly. The sponge is a plant. It has to be dug up. And it'll die within an hour without the bog mud. He said the gatherers don't know what it is and will think it's a mushroom. Gruel lay down. The column passed 300 paces from the shoal. They walked without looking around. Dorian lay in the mud, watching them through the grass and counting. 40 people. Masks with tubes, so they don't filter the air through their skin. That means if a person takes off their mask, they take 9 breaths. So they have a weak spot, and it's on their face. He watched them intently until the last one disappeared into the fog. Then he stood up. He asked Gruel where they were going. Gruel said north, toward the venomers' nests. Dorian asked how long they'd be there. Gruel said 8 days. Then they'd head back across the causeway. Dorian asked which causeway. Gruel said that very one. The only one. The one with the tower and the archers. Dorian stood there looking north, and it all began to make sense in his mind. The only way out of the quagmire is the causeway. The causeway is guarded by a tower. Once a year, 40 men cross it carrying a cargo. The cargo is iron. They're paid in silver for the iron. Dorian turned to Gruel and asked him what would happen if the collectors didn't return. Gruel said others would come and there would be war. Dorian said there wouldn't be. Gruel asked why. Dorian said war happens when something is taken away. He said he wasn't going to take anything away. He was going to sell. Gruel looked at him as if he were crazy. He said that no one would sell anything to the swamp dwellers, and no one would buy anything from them. He said they were rotten. Dorian said he wasn't a swamp dweller. He raised his left hand and showed the brand, 3 stripes and a circle. He said he was an exile from House Vex, that he had a name, and that this name was known beyond the causeway. Gruel fell silent. Dorian looked at the fruit in his hand. 91%. Then he looked north toward where 40 masked men had gone. He said that in 8 days, the collectors would return. He said that by then he needed to have something to show them. The woman with the bark asked why he needed to show them anything. Dorian said that a man with a cargo always returns to where he came from. He said he didn't need the cargo. He needed the one who was after the cargo. He said that behind the 40 collectors stood a merchant, and that the merchant would set the price. Gruel said that the merchant would turn him over to House Vex for a reward. Dorian said he would. He said that the merchant would turn anyone over for copper. Gruel then asked, why? Dorian said that the merchant would hand him over to the House of Vex only if it was more profitable to hand him over than to trade. He picked up the fruit. He said that the House of Vex pays silver at 41%. He said he had 91. He said the merchant knew how to count. Gruel stared at him for a long time. Then he said that Dorian was a terrible person. Dorian said no. He said he was just a man who'd been cast out and who'd done the math. They returned to the settlement by nightfall. Branch was waiting on the central platform. He already knew about the sponge. He asked if the threads were gone. Dorian said it was all over. Branch asked if it was gone for good. Dorian said as long as the sponge works. He said they needed more sponges and that they should be placed in a ring around the settlement. He said that then the threads would travel along the ring and not enter the interior. Branch asked how many were needed. Dorian said 31. He explained that with a radius of 11 meters and a spacing of 400 meters, 31 sponges would form a closed ring around all the platforms. Branch asked how long it would take. Dorian said that each sponge yields 11 seeds in 9 days. He said that from a single sponge, after 3 generations, there would be more than 1,000. He said the ring would be complete in 27 days. Branch was silent for a long time. Then he said that Dorian had 12 days and that 5 had passed. Dorian said he remembered. Branch said that in 7 days he would come to Rotten and take a look, and that the agreement hadn't changed. Dorian said the agreement hadn't changed. The Branch asked him directly why he needed Rot if he already had the sponge, the ring, and a tribe that would follow him. Dorian answered him just as directly. He said that the sponge was a patch. He said that threads were emerging from Gnil, and that until he understood why they had started coming out 2 years ago, he hadn't decided anything. He said that the patch would hold until it tore somewhere else. Branch looked at him from within his bark for a very long time. Then he said that in 61 years, he'd never heard anyone in the bog talk about the future. He said that here, everyone lives only until morning. He said that Dorian thinks years ahead and that this will either save everyone or kill everyone. Dorian didn't answer. He went down to the clear circle by the ashtray. The bodies had already been removed. The mud was smooth. He sat down there and laid out what he had in front of him. 3 ash tree seeds, 4 armored seed pods, 11 sponge seeds he'd harvested that evening, 1 fruit containing the concentrate, and a knot of white thread he'd never gotten around to using. Dorian picked up the knot and stared at it. The thread hung before him, waiting. Penetration through any organic barrier. Remote search for a clean environment. Assimilation of the host. He thought about how all 3 properties were right there in the palm of his hand, and that he didn't know what to combine them with. Then he raised his head and looked east. He thought about Rot, and about how something had happened there 400 years ago. He thought that the threads hadn't come from nowhere. They too had a parent. And somewhere in the center of Rot, that parent was still sitting there. Dorian clenched the knot in his fist. Then he stood up and walked toward the stairs. Gruel was waiting for him upstairs, and he wasn't alone. There were no longer just 11 standing with him. There were about 40 of them. All of them were armed with spears. Everyone was looking at Dorian. Gruel said they would go to Rotten. Dorian said they would die. Gruel said they were dying anyway. Dorian looked at them, and for a second, something in his expression flickered. Then he said they would set out at dawn. He said they had 7 days. He didn't tell them the rest. He didn't say it would take 1.5 years to reach the center of Rot. He didn't say he had no plan for how to make it there in 7 days. He only knew that he had a knot of thread that could pass through any barrier and sense purity from a distance. And that somewhere in the center of Rot sat the thing that had created it, and that the thread always knows the way home. They set out at dawn, and Dorian counted 43 people. 2 had arrived during the night. He didn't try to talk them out of it. He walked ahead, carrying a leather sack on his shoulder. Inside the sack was everything he owned. Gruel walked second. The woman with the bark on the left side of her face walked third, and Dorian finally asked her name. She said her name was Urson. He nodded and said nothing more. They walked for 3 hours to the edge of rottenness. The black wall stood as it always had. The armored one inside was in place, and his clean spot glowed in the blackness like a hole. Dorian stopped everyone 20 paces from the wall. He turned and looked at the 43 faces. Then he stated the first rule. He said that no one was to enter the blackness further than 40 paces. He said that only he could step was a limit only he could endure, and that anyone else would die by the 9th. Urson asked what they were doing there then. Dorian said they would be digging. Gruel asked what they were digging for. Dorian pointed to the edge of the black wall. He said they needed a rampart. He said they needed a mound of brown mud as tall as a man and 200 paces long along the edge. He said that behind this rampart, the brown air would linger longer, and that from there he would be able to go into the black and come back without an hour to recover in the open field. Gruel said it would be a week's work for 40 men. Dorian said it would take 3 days if they dug nonstop. Gruel looked at him and said they had only 7 days total. Dorian said he knew. They began digging. Dorian dug alongside everyone else for the first 2 hours. Then Gruel took the shovel, made from a poisoner's blade, from him and said he'd be more useful elsewhere. Dorian didn't argue. He walked over to the armored one, sat down in its clear circle, and took out a knot of white thread. He stared at it for a long time. The thread hung before him. Penetration through any organic barrier. Remote search for a pure environment. Assimilation of the host. He thought about the second property, remote search. The thread had found the ashtray in the settlement in a single night, across kilometers of dead marsh. So it senses. That means it has a direction. That means if he could see where it was heading, he'd know where the purity was. Dorian raised his head, and then he turned his train of thought around 180 degrees. All this time, he'd been thinking of the thread as something that seeks out purity. But that was only one half of it. The other half was that the thread always, it has a root. It has a place from which it grew. If a plant senses the pure from a distance, then it also senses itself from a distance. He couldn't verify this with logic. He could only cross them and see. Dorian took out a pepper tree seed, an ordinary one. First generation. He held the seed in his right hand and the knot in his left. The screen flashed. Crossbreeding request. Poisonous ash tree and white thread. Inherited trait of the first. Poison absorption. Inherited trait of the second. Remote environment detection. Warning. Second-order carrier. Stability reduced. Life force consumption, 23%. Dorian looked at the number and did not confirm. He sat there with the seed and the knot in his hands, thinking, 23%. Last time, 19% had brought him to his knees. 23 would even harder, and he didn't know the result. He would get a bush that could seek out the pure, a bush that didn't walk, a bush that would sit in the mud and reach out to the side. Dorian froze. It would reach out to the side. It would point the way. Dorian confirmed. The seed turned icy in an instant. The cold traveled up his arm, reaching his shoulder and chest. Dorian felt something being drawn from him, not strength. Something else. Something from his bones. He collapsed onto his side and his body arched. Everything went white before his eyes. He didn't unclench his hand. 14 seconds. Then it let go. Dorian lay on his side within a clear circle and couldn't move the fingers of his left hand. The text flashed. Crossbreeding complete. Species created. Pointer. Trait. The plant orients its stem toward the nearest source of a clean environment. Range is unlimited. Side effect. Does not absorb poison. Does not produce seeds. Lives for 11 days. Dorian read the side effect and closed his eyes. Does not produce seeds. That meant he would have only one pointer. 23% of his life force for a single plant that would die in 11 days and leave nothing behind. He lay there, wondering if it had been worth it. Then he realized that wasn't the question. The question was that the pointer would show the direction to purity. And there is no purity in rot. So it would point to the only pure place there is, to where the threads had come from. Dorian opened his eyes. He tried to sit up but couldn't. He called out. No one heard him because no sound came out. He was lying in the circle of purity, 200 paces away from the 43 people, and couldn't lift his arm. Half an hour passed. Then Urson stood over him. She looked at him, crouched down, lifted him by the shoulders, and sat him up. She didn't ask what had happened. She took out a flask and poured water into his mouth. The water tasted stale, but Dorian drank it all. Then he was able to speak. He said they needed 8 more hours. Ursine said the wall was already 40 paces away. Dorian said that wasn't enough. She said she knew. Then she said something he hadn't expected. She said she'd watched him cut out her brother's lung. She said he hadn't looked away even once. She said everyone else had looked away, but he hadn't. Dorian didn't answer. Urson said she didn't know if he was a good person or not. She said she didn't care. She said she just wanted it to be over. Then she got up and went back to digging. Dorian sat in the circle until evening. By nightfall, he was able to stand up. He went out to the rampart and looked. The rampart ran along the edge of the rotten land for 80 paces and was chest high. 43 people were digging in the darkness with their hands and bone shovels, and no one had stopped. Dorian stood and watched it intently. Then he picked up a shovel and joined the line. Gruel wanted to say but didn't. They dug all night. By dawn, the embankment was 200 paces long and as tall as a man. Dorian climbed onto it and looked down into the brown mud behind him. He crouched down and stuck his hand into the mud at the base of the rampart. He pressed an armored beetle's seed into it. Gruel asked why it was there. Dorian said that the rampart held in the brown air, and that the armored beetle would produce a shell twice as large in the brown air as it would in the black. He said this would be their camp. He said they could sleep here. A day later, the armored beetle emerged. It was thicker than any of the previous ones. Its shell covered an area 4 meters beyond the embankment. Inside, the air wasn't brown. It was almost transparent. 43 swamp dwellers crawled inside, lay down, and for the first time in their lives slept without poison. Dorian did not sleep. He sat on the embankment, holding the pointing plant seed in his hand, and waited for dawn. In the morning, he planted it. The pointing plant did not grow like a bush. It grew like a single bare stick. The gray-white stem, without a single leaf, rose up to his waist and stopped. It was straight. It stood upright and didn't move. Dorian stared at it for an hour. Nothing happened. Gruel walked over and asked what it was. Dorian said it was a compass. Gruel asked what a compass was. Dorian said it was something that showed you which way to go. Gruel looked at the bare stick and said nothing. Another 2 hours passed. Then the pointer twitched. It bent. Not much. The tip tilted about 10 degrees. Dorian jumped to his feet. He looked to see where. The stem was pointing west, toward the armored vehicle behind the rampart. Dorian cursed for the first time ever. He realized his mistake immediately. The pointer was pointing to the nearest clear area, and the nearest clear area was his own camp. He yanked the pointer out of the mud, roots and all. A line flashed red. The pointer. Root connection severed. Viability dropping. 8 days. Dorian held the uprooted plant in his hands and stared at it. 8 days instead of 11. He'd used up 23% and had already burned through 3 days out of 11 for a single mistake. He told Gruel that he was heading to the rot right now. Gruel said it was too soon. Dorian said it was too late. He tucked the pointer under his arm and walked toward the black wall. Gruel followed him and stopped at the boundary. Dorian entered the rot, counted 40 steps, and stood at the edge of the clean circle of the armored one inside. He pressed the pointer into the black mud. The line spoke. Root connection partially restored. Viability, 7 days. Dorian took a step back and waited. The pointer stood straight. 1 minute, 2. On the third, it bent. Dorian looked to see where. The stem pointed east, into the depths of the rot, not at the armored one 4 steps away from him. East. Dorian froze. He crouched and looked at the angle. The stem bent eastward and slightly northward. He completely ignored the clean circle around him. So there, to the east, was something cleaner than the armored one's shell. Something at the very center of the black quagmire was cleaner than anything in this land. Dorian stood and looked at the bare stick that was showing him the way, and it finally clicked in his mind. The threads didn't come out of the rot because the rot is dirty. The threads came out of something pure that sits in the middle of the rot, and it had stopped holding them 2 years ago. Dorian stepped into the blackness and began to count. On the count of 41, the red appeared. At 90, the skin on his cheek burst. At 120, he pressed the first seed of the armored creature into the mud and turned around. At 206, he stepped out and fell. Gruel dragged him behind the wall. Dorian lay behind the wall for 4 hours without moving, and Irson sat beside him, pouring water into him. The line was flashing. Degradation, 52%. Regeneration, 11% per hour. Dorian counted in his head as he lay there. 52% in 3 minutes in the black. He could hold out for about 6 minutes before the irreversible began. He didn't know exactly where the irreversible began. He only knew it existed because the display called it degradation, not fatigue. After 5 hours, he was able to stand up. He looked toward the east. The black wall stood. He waited a full day. He didn't sleep. He sat on the rampart and stared intently, and Gruel sat beside him in silence. At dawn, a second hole opened in the black wall. It was smaller than the first. The armored shell had grown deeper, and its circumference was not 2 meters. It was 1 meter 40. The system reported, the armored one is a quagmire. Radius, 1 meter 41. Shell integrity, 62%. External pressure is high. Dorian read the report, and his expression did not change. 62% in a day. Deeper down, the pressure is stronger. The shell is thinner. The circle is smaller. He calculated ahead. The third circle will be 1 meter. The fourth will be half a meter. There won't be a fifth at all. He doesn't have 5 circles to the center. He has 3. And he won't survive the third circle because there will still be 20,000 steps from there to the clear zone. Dorian stood up and walked toward Rot. Gruel grabbed him by the shoulder. Dorian shook off his hand and said nothing. He stepped into the black, and on the count of 41, the red appeared. On the count of 120, he reached the second circle and stepped inside. The red faded. He stood in a circle 1 meter 40 wide, surrounded by blackness. He thrust the pointer into the mud and waited. 3 minutes. The pointer bent toward the east. Dorian looked at the angle. It was the same. It hadn't changed by a single degree. So the source was far away. That meant the 120 steps hadn't changed anything on the scale. Dorian crouched inside the circle and looked at the black mist outside. He stared at it for a very long time. He searched for a change in color, but found none. Then he noticed something else. The mist was moving. It wasn't just hanging there. It was flowing. It was flowing from east to west in a steady stream. And Dorian hadn't noticed it before because, out at the edge of the rot, the stream had already begun to dissipate. Here, at 120 paces, it was visible. A black suspension was flowing outward from the center. Dorian froze. He thought about it for a minute and a half. Then he stepped out of the circle and into the black, took 20 paces eastward, stopped, and raised his hand. He felt pressure on his palm. Not strong, but it was there. Wind. Not the wind. A current. He turned around, walked back, and stepped into the circle. The red light in the center went out. Dorian sat down in the mud. He realized one more thing, and it turned everything upside down. Rot doesn't stand still. Rot blows. Something in the center has been exhaling the black mist outward for 400 years straight. So the center is not a place of purity. The center is the source of poison. And the pointer is pointing there. And that means the pointer isn't pointing at a pure place. It's pointing at a pure being in the middle of a filthy place. Dorian yanked out the pointer and headed outside. He stepped out on the count of 210 and fell behind the embankment, vomiting black. Gruel turned him over, and Irson held his head. Dorian muttered a single word through clenched teeth. Breathing. Gruel asked, "Who?" Dorian couldn't answer. He lost consciousness for the first time. He came to in the middle of the night. He was lying in the shell of a tank behind the rampart, surrounded by swamp dwellers, all 43 of them. No one was sleeping. Dorian sat up. He looked at his hands. The skin on his left hand was gray up to the elbow and wasn't regenerating. The display read, degradation 71%, regeneration 4% per hour. Dorian looked at the number. 4. It was 11 o'clock. He realized his threshold was dropping. Every trip into the black makes the next one harder. It wasn't infinite. It had never been infinite. It was just very large, and he was using it up. Dorian said aloud that he had 2 trips left. Gruel asked, "And then?" Dorian said that after that, he wouldn't come out. Urson said that in that case, he shouldn't go. Dorian said he had to. He explained everything he'd figured out to them, speaking slowly because it was difficult. He said that something was breathing at the center of rot. He said it was exhaling black sludge outward and had been doing so for 400 years. He said that since the pointer was pointing at it, that meant it was clean on the inside. He said it was clean on the inside and dirty on the outside, like a swamp, but the other way around. He said that 2 years ago, threads had crawled out of it. He said those threads were its children or parts of it, and they had crawled out to seek something clean because things had gone bad. Irson asked how he knew it had become bad. Dorian said that children don't leave home if things are good at home. Everyone fell silent. Gruel said that meant the creature was dying. Dorian said yes. He said the creature had been dying for 400 years, but for the last 2 years it had been dying quickly. He said that when it dies, everything it has been holding inside will come pouring out. He said it was like a sack now. He said that all the rot was what had already leaked out of the sack. He said there was still more inside the sack. Gruel asked how much. Dorian said he didn't know and that it didn't matter. He said something else was important. He said that over 400 years, so much had leaked out of the sack that it had killed a section of the quagmire 2 days' journey long. He said that if the sack burst all at once, it would engulf everything. Irson asked about the settlement. Dorian said it would engulf the settlement, the quagmire, the causeway, the tower, and everything beyond the causeway. He said this flatly and without emotion, and that made it even worse. There was a long silence. Then Gruel asked him directly how much was left. Dorian said he didn't know. He said that 2 years ago, people started dying, which meant the bag had started to tear 2 years ago. He said that 6,000 deaths in 2 years was the rate, and that the rate was accelerating. He said that about 1,000 had died in the first year, and about 3,000 in the last 6 months. He asked Gruel if that was correct. Gruel did the math in his head and said yes. Dorian said that, in that case, there was less than a year left. He said it might be months. Irson stood up, walked to the edge of the shell, and stood there with her back turned. Gruel sat motionless. Then he said that the chief had given them 12 days and that 7 had passed. He asked what Dorian would tell Branch in 5 days. Dorian looked at him and said he would tell the truth. Gruel asked which one. Dorian said he would say that the tribe needed to be let out. Gruel laughed. It was the first time he had laughed, and it was a laugh. He said there was nowhere to lead them. He said there was a causeway and archers to the west, and that 3,000 swamp dwellers on the causeway were 3,000 targets. He said they'd be killed beyond the causeway because 3 copper coins were paid for each swamp dweller. He said they were trapped. Dorian said he knew. Then he said that a sack wasn't a wall. Gruel asked, "What?" Dorian said that the sack was the price. He said that a swamp dweller is killed for 3 copper coins because he's worth minus 3 copper coins. He said that no one kills someone who's worth silver. He said that if a swamp dweller were worth more than the bounty on his head, the causeway would open on its own. Gruel said that a swamp dweller couldn't be worth silver. Dorian said that a swamp dweller isn't. He reached into the sack and pulled out a hunter's sponge fruit. He placed it on the mud between them. He said that this was worth silver. He said that the House of Vex sells purified poison at 41% of the price of silver per ounce. He said that this fruit contained 91% and weighed 11 ounces. He said that 1 sponge yields 60 fruits in 9 days. He said that a ring of 31 sponges around the settlement yields 1,860 fruits every 9 days. He said that this amounted to 20,000 ounces of concentrate, twice as good as that produced by the continent's finest alchemical house. He fell silent and looked at Gruel. Gruel was staring at the fruit. Then he raised his head and said he didn't understand the numbers. Dorian said there was no need to understand them. He said there was one thing they needed to understand. He said that in 9 days, the marsh would become the richest land in the world. He said that then the marsh dwellers would cease to be scum and would become the ones who held this land. He said they would be paid for, not have bounties on their heads. Gruel was silent for a long time. Then he said that it was a beautiful idea, but that the creature in the center would die first. Dorian said that was true. He said that was why he was getting involved in the dark side. He said that if he didn't stop the creature, there would be no one left to count the wealth. He said that if he stopped the creature but there was no trade, they would die within a year at the hands of tax collectors and archers. He said they had to do both at the same time and that there was no time for anything else. Ursen turned away from the edge of the shell. She said he was talking about trade and the bag and the schedules. She asked him directly what he wanted for himself. Dorian looked at her. He was silent for 8 seconds. Then he said he wanted the land that everyone considers trash to be worth more than those who threw it away. He said this calmly. Ursen said that was revenge. Dorian said no. He said revenge is when you go somewhere and kill. He said he wasn't going anywhere. Dorian stood on the platform, and 3,000 swamp dwellers looked up at him from the bridges below. He didn't give a speech. He asked how many hands they had. Vetev didn't understand. Dorian rephrased the question. He asked how many people could work. Vetev said about 2,000. Dorian nodded and began to assign tasks. He spoke quickly and without pauses, and Gruel repeated after him louder so that those on the distant bridges could hear. He said that 400 people were going to set up the ring. He said that 22 sponges were needed to join the 9 already in place, that the spacing between them was 400 meters, and that the ring had to be closed in 3 days, not 27. He said that to do this, they shouldn't wait for the sponge to produce seeds, but should take seeds from the 9 that were already in place right now. Vomavi said they bear fruit on the 9th day. Dorian said the first sponge was on its 10th day. He went down the stairs and walked toward the first sponge, and everyone followed him. He climbed up its stem and spread apart the folds on the cap. Inside, between the gills, were the spores. He counted 11. He plucked them all, jumped down, and showed them to the crowd in his open palm. He said, "Here's the ring." He said that in 9 days, each of these 11 would produce one more 11. He said that in 18 days, they would have 121 sponges. He said that in 27 days, there would be 1,331. He said that then the ring would cease to be a ring and would become a field. He said that then the marsh would change. The crowd was buzzing. Dorian raised his hand, and they fell silent. And he continued speaking. He said that the second 1,000 people would gather the fruit. He said that the fruit must not be touched with bare hands because it contains 91% concentrate and will corrode even a swamp dweller. He said they would need bark baskets and that each fruit must be placed separately. He said he would hold anyone accountable for any fruit that burst in the basket. Someone in the crowd asked why they should harvest poison when there was already plenty of it all around. Dorian replied loudly.
He said that poison is scattered throughout the air all around us, and that no one pays for the air. He said that the poison in the fruit is collected and purified, and that they're paid in silver for what they harvest. He said that the Vex house produces the same thing in 4 distillations, gets 41%, and sells it as the best on the continent. He held up the fruit and said they had 91 of them, and that he'd grown it himself. The crowd didn't quite understand. Dorian could see they didn't understand. He didn't bother to explain it again. He said the third thing. He said it would take 200 people to build a warehouse. Branch asked why the swamp dwellers needed a warehouse. Dorian said that in 27 days they would have 20,000 ounces of concentrate and that it had to be stored somewhere. He said the warehouse had to be built on dry ground. Gruel said there was no dry ground in the quagmire. Dorian said there would be. He reached into the sack and pulled out the last 2 armored plant seeds. He said that when grown in the brown air, the armored plant forms a 4-meter-thick shell and that the shell doesn't let moisture through either. He said that if they planted them in a row and let them grow, there would be dry ground beneath them. He said this would be the first dry patch in the quagmire in 400 years. Branch stood there looking at him and said nothing. Dorian turned to face him and said the 4th thing, and this was meant only for him. He said they needed 2 people who knew how to count. Branch asked why. Dorian said they needed to keep records. He said they had to write down how many fruits were harvested from which sponge on which day. He said that without numbers, in a month they wouldn't know how much they had, and the very first merchant would cheat them. Branch said that no one in the tribe knew how to write. Dorian fell silent. He looked at the 3,000 people on the bridges and realized he hadn't thought of that. 400 years without writing. He turned to Irzan and asked if she knew how to count. She said she could count to 20. Dorian said that would be enough for the first month. He said he would teach them the rest. Then he said one last thing. He said they needed 40 people to meet the gatherers at the gate in 8 days. The crowd fell silent instantly. Gruel stepped forward and said that this was war. Dorian said no. He said that war is when you go with spears. He said that they would go with goods. He said that the collectors would cross the quagmire with a load of iron and that a merchant was waiting for them beyond the causeway. He said that this merchant needed to be shown the fruit. Gruel asked who would go. Dorian said he would. Gruel said he would be killed. He said that Dorian had a brand on his hand and that the collectors saw the brand and took copper in exchange for it. Dorian said he knew. He raised his left hand. The skin on it was gray up to his elbow from the rot. The brand on his wrist was almost invisible beneath the gray. Dorian looked at him and said that in 8 days he wouldn't be there at all. He said that the rot had erased him. Gruel said that wouldn't help because Dorian had a human face on top. Dorian said that was exactly what would help.
He said the merchant wouldn't talk to a swamp dweller.
He said the merchant would only talk to a human with a normal skin who knew the price per ounce. He said that was why he needed his face. He said it was the only thing he had left from House Vex, and that he was going to use it.
Branch asked one thing quietly. He asked what would happen if the merchant recognized him. Dorian said the merchant would definitely recognize him. Branch asked, then what was the point? Dorian said the merchant wouldn't hand him over to the House of X right away. He said the merchant would do the math first. He said the merchant would come up with two figures: the bounty on the head of the third son of the House of Vex and the profit from 20,000 ounces at 91% per year. He said the second figure was hundreds of times greater. He said the merchant was greedy and that greed was the most reliable thing in a person. Branch was silent for a long time. Then he said that in 61 years, he had never heard of anyone so calmly staking his life on another man's greed. Dorian said he wasn't staking his life. He was staking numbers. Dorian set out at dawn, accompanied only by Gruel and Earson. He took no one else with him. They walked for 6 hours without speaking. 12 men sat on the rampart at the edge of rottenness, left to guard the camp. The armored one stood behind the rampart, its shell held in the transparent air, and it was even warm inside. Dorian lay down inside the pod and ordered to be woken up in 4 hours. He slept through them without dreaming. Earson woke him up, and he sat up and looked at his left hand. The skin was gray up to his elbow and hadn't regenerated in 3 days. The program said, degradation 69%, regeneration 3% per hour. Dorian looked at the number. 3. He said aloud that he had 1 run. Gruel asked how long. Dorian did the math. He said that at 69%, he'd last in the black for about 2 minutes before the damage became irreversible. He said that 2 minutes was 120 steps. He said that the second circle was at 120. He said that meant he'd reach the second circle, and that would be it. Gruel said there was no point in going then. Dorian said there was a point. He took out the pointer. The stem was white and dry and bent between his fingers. The line said, lifespan 31 hours. Dorian said he would place it in the second circle and leave it there. Earson asked why, if it was already pointing east. Dorian said it had been pointing to an angle. He said an angle is a direction, not a distance. He said he needed a distance. Earson asked how a stick could show a distance. Dorian said it couldn't. He said 2 sticks would show it. He sat down in the mud and drew a diagram with his finger. He marked a point and drew a line from it at an angle. Then he marked a second point to the side and drew a second line at a different angle. The lines converged. He pointed to the point where they met. He said that if you know the angle from 2 different locations, the point where the lines meet is the target. He said it always works and that you don't need to go there to find it. Gruel looked at the drawing and said nothing. Then he asked where the second stick was. Dorian said that the second stick was the first circle. He said he had measured the angle in the first circle and in the second, and that the angles were the same. He said this meant one of 2 things. Either the source was so far away that 120 steps made no difference, or he hadn't measured accurately. He said he'd measured by eye, and that a 10-degree difference isn't visible to the naked eye. Earson asked what that meant then. Dorian said they needed a longer baseline. He said that if they placed the pointer at 2 points separated by not 120 paces but a kilometer apart, the difference in angle would be visible even to the naked eye. Gruel said there was a kilometer along the edge of the rot. Dorian nodded. He said that was all. He said there was no need to go deeper. He said they needed to measure from both ends of the shaft, that the shaft was 200 paces long, and that it needed to be extended. Gruel said that 200 steps isn't a kilometer. Dorian said that the edge of the rot extends even further, and that the rampart isn't necessary. He said we just need to walk a kilometer along the edge and stick a stick in the ground. He fell silent. Then he said out loud that he was an idiot. Earson asked why. Dorian said that he'd spent 3 days burning himself in the black just to measure something that could be measured from the outside. He said that the pointer points to the source from any point. He said it wasn't necessary to be inside the rot. It was enough to be anywhere within its reach. He said the range was unlimited, and that it had been written in the line from the very beginning, and that he'd read it but hadn't understood it. Gruel said he shouldn't have gone into the black at all. Dorian said he had to. He said that if he hadn't gone in, he wouldn't have seen that the fog was flowing and wouldn't have realized that the creature was breathing. He said that the mistake had given him the most important insight, whereas the correct move would have yielded only a number. Then he stood up, and they walked along the edge of the rot toward the north. They walked a kilometer, and it took an hour because the edge wasn't straight. Dorian measured the distance in steps and counted aloud, and Earson counted along with him so as not to lose track. At the 1,281st step, he stopped. He thrust the pointer into the brown mud. The stalk stood for 3 minutes and then bent. Dorian crouched down and stared at the angle for a long time. Then he said, there was something. Gruel asked what. Dorian said the angle had shifted. He said that at the first point, the stalk had pointed east and slightly north. He said that here it pointed east and slightly south. He said the lines converged. He took a bone knife and drew a diagram in the mud. He marked 2 points and drew 2 lines, and they met. He looked at the point where they met, measured the distance on the diagram, and converted it into steps. Then he froze. He calculated it again. Earson asked how many. Dorian didn't answer right away. He said it couldn't be. He measured a third time. Then he gave a number. He said it was 4,100 steps to the source. Gruel said that wasn't true. He said it was a 2-day journey to the center of Gnil and that everyone knew that. Dorian said everyone knew it was a 2-day journey to the other end of Gnil. He said that wasn't the same thing. He said that for 400 years, everyone had assumed the source was in the middle, because that was the logical conclusion. He said the source wasn't in the middle. He said the source was right at the edge, their edge. He said the black sludge flowed from east to west and that everyone had concluded it flowed outward from the depths. He said that it flows from the source and that the source stands right here, blowing westward across the entire rottenness. He said that the entire rottenness isn't a circle around the creature. It's a trail. It's what she's blown out over 400 years, carried by the wind. He said that all this time, they'd been standing right next to her. Gruel sat down right in the mud. Irsina looked at the map and said nothing. Dorian counted aloud. 4,100 steps east of this point. He can manage 120. He said that was 34 times too little. Then he raised his head and looked at the black wall. He said that now everything was changing. Gruel asked what would change if he didn't make it anyway. Dorian said that before, he had to walk 20,000 steps, and that was impossible no matter what. He said that now he had to walk 4,000, and that was impossible for him alone. He said that 4,000 steps equaled 100 armored soldiers, each taking 41 steps. He said that each one grew in a day and produced 4 seeds. He said that if he planted them one at a time, it would take 100 days, and he wouldn't be able to hold out that long. He said that if he planted them in a fan pattern, it wouldn't take 100 days. He said that 100 armored plants equaled 4 generations. He said that in 5 days, he could cover 4,000 steps if he had enough hands to plant them. Gruel said that the hands would die in the black on the 9th breath. Dorian fell silent. He sat there, staring at the sketch in the dirt. Then he raised his head and looked at Gruel very intently. He said they wouldn't die. Gruel asked why. Dorian said that an armored one creates a circle 1.40 meters in diameter. He said that a person inside the circle isn't in the black. He said that if the circles are 41 steps apart, then you have to run 41 steps between them. He said that 41 steps is 9 seconds of running. He said that 9 breaths isn't 9 seconds. He said that a person can hold their breath. Gruel slowly raised his head. Dorian kept talking, and he spoke quickly. He said that rot kills through the skin, not through the mouth, and that he'd figured that out on the first day. He said that the skin can be sealed. He said that the gatherers have resin-soaked cloaks and masks with tubes, and that they walk through the quagmire without rotting. He said that a swamp dweller needed to seal their skin for 9 seconds and run to the next circle. He said that in 9 seconds, the black sludge wouldn't even burn through bark. Earson stood up. Haldkern was silent for 11 seconds. Dorian counted them. Then, the merchant did a strange thing. He sat down. He sat right on the planks of the platform among the swamp dwellers with their spears, placed the fruit on his lap, and began to examine it. He said he was 54 years old. He said that for 22 of those years, he had been transporting the poisoner's ores across the causeway, and that during that time, he had buried 19 gatherers. He said that every year he paid a toll to the tower, and that every year the toll increased. He said that the House of X buys raw material from him at 3 copper per iron and sells the purified poison for 1 silver per ounce. He said that 1 iron yields 2 ounces. He said that his whole life he had been getting 3 copper coins from what others make 2 silver coins from. He said he had known this for a long time, and that there was nothing he could do about it because purification is the house's craft, and the recipe is kept by 4 heads, all of whom bear the surname Vex. He picked up a fruit and looked up at Dorian. He said that now the recipe grows out of the mud. Dorian said yes. Kern asked how many days it takes to grow. Dorian said 9. Kern asked how many fruiting bodies the mushroom produces. Dorian said 60. Kern asked how many mushrooms could be planted. Dorian gestured toward the bog around them and said that was the wrong question. He said the right question was how much poison was in the bog. He said the mushroom doesn't make the poison. The mushroom collects it. He said the bog has been poisoning this land for 400 years, and that all this poison is now a commodity. Kern closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them and asked what Dorian wanted. Dorian sat down across from him on the planks. He spoke first. He said he wanted them to stop paying 3 copper coins for a swamp dweller. Kern said that wasn't his call. Dorian said it was, in fact, his call. He said they paid 3 copper coins because a swamp dweller was worthless. He said that if Kern started buying from the swamp dwellers would gain value. He said that a person with value is no longer rotten. Kern said that the tower wouldn't let the swamp dwellers through the causeway anyway. Dorian said the swamp creature wouldn't go anyway. He said cargo would pass through this causeway, and Kern would transport the cargo. He said the tower didn't care whose cargo it let through, as long as the toll was paid. Kern thought for a moment and nodded. Dorian made a second point. He said he wanted Kern not to sell the concentrate to the House of Vex. Kern laughed. He said that no one but the House of Vex would buy it. He said that the House of Vex controlled 1/4 of the continent's alchemy market, and that all apothecaries bought from them. He said that if he took 20,000 ounces somewhere else, they'd find him in a ditch within a month. Dorian said he wasn't suggesting they transport it. He said he was suggesting they sell it.
Kern didn't get it. Dorian explained.
He said the Vex house sells at 41% of the silver price per ounce. He said an apothecary doesn't need a percentage, an apothecary needs a dose. He said that if the purity is 91, then each dose would require half as much of the substance. He said that means their 1 ounce is worth 2 ounces of Vexes. He said that means they can sell it for 8 copper coins and still make more than Vex does from silver. He said that any apothecary who does the math will leave Vex within 9 days. Kern sat motionless. Dorian said that the House of Vex wouldn't be able to respond. He said that Vex had 4 smelting runs, furnaces, and master craftsmen, and 41% was their ceiling after 200 years of craftsmanship. He said they had a fungus that grew out of the dirt for 9 days, for free. He said this wasn't competition. It was a different price for everything. Kern was silent for a very long time. Then he asked quietly if Dorian understood what he was saying. Dorian said he did. Kern said that the House of Vex wasn't just a shop. He said it was 4,000 people, 2 cities, and a treaty with the crown. He said that if you took alchemy away from them, they'd have nothing left. Dorian said he knew. Kern looked at him, and something flashed in his eyes. He said it was a personal matter. Dorian didn't answer. Kern said he wouldn't ask. He said he didn't care why the third son had been thrown into the quagmire. He said something else was important to him. He asked what would happen when the House of Vex found out. Dorian said they'd find out in a month. He said the first apothecary to stop buying from them would write to them, and they'd send someone. Kern asked, "And then what?" Dorian said, "Then they'll come here." Kern said that no one ever comes here. Dorian said that people didn't come here before because there was nothing here. He said that now there are 20,000 ounces here every 9 days and that everyone would come for it. He said it wouldn't be the collectors who came. The house will come. Kern asked how much time they had. Dorian said a month or a month and a half. Kern said that wasn't enough. Dorian said it was enough. Kern asked what for. Dorian said so that it would become more expensive for them to fight than to buy. He said that the House of Vex comes to kill when killing is cheaper. He said that if, by the time they arrived, all the alchemy on the continent were dependent on these mushrooms, the House of Vex wouldn't be able to burn them because then it would burn itself as well. He said that then they wouldn't come with soldiers. They would come with an offer. And only then would he talk. Kern sat with the fruit on his lap. Then he raised his head and looked at Vetvia, who had been standing nearby the whole time, silent. He asked the chief if he understood what this man was planning to do to his tribe. Vetvia said he understood. Kern asked what he thought. Vetvia said that his tribe hadn't died for 8 days in a row, the first time in 2 years. He said that whoever could count should do so from here on out. Kern laughed briefly. Then he stood up, brushed off his cloak, and held out his hand to Dorian. Dorian looked at the hand. Kern said he was taking 480 fruits right now. He said he'd pay 200 in silver up front for them. Dorian said no. Kern raised an eyebrow. Dorian said he wouldn't take silver. Kern asked what he would take instead. Dorian said he'd take resin. He said he needed 300 sets, a cloak, a mask, and a pipe for each. He said he needed them in 5 days. Kern stood with his hand outstretched, his expression becoming very attentive. He said that 300 sets was a squad's worth of gear. He said he dealt in poison, not weapons. He asked why an exile would need 300 cloaks. Dorian said he was planning to go into the rot. Kern lowered his hand. He said they didn't go into the rot. Dorian said they did go there. He raised his left arm and showed the gray skin up to his elbow. He said he'd been there 4 times. Kern stared at his arm for a long time. Then he asked why. And Dorian told him the truth. He said that 4,000 steps from the edge of rot sits something that has been spewing poison onto the quagmire for 400 years. He said it was dying, and that when it burst, everything it had accumulated would pour out at once. He said that then there would be no quagmire, no causeway, no tower, and no 2 cities, the home of the Vex. Kern stood motionless. Then he said he didn't believe it. Dorian said he didn't have to. He said that Kern was a merchant, and that a merchant shouldn't be believed. He said that a merchant had to do the math. He said that if he was right, Kern would lose everything in a year. He said that if he was wrong, Kern would lose 300 cloaks. He asked which was more valuable. Kern was silent for a very long time. Then he said one word, 5 days. He turned and walked toward the stairs. Halfway up, he stopped and said without turning around that if Dorian didn't leave rotten, he'd take the fruit anyway. Dorian said, "Go ahead and take it." Kern walked off into the fog alone and unescorted, just as he had arrived. The work began that very hour. Dorian hadn't slept for 3 days straight. He divided everything into 4 streams and kept them all in his head at once. The first stream. The ring. 22 new sponges were installed over 3 days, and the ring closed with a spacing of 280 meters. Ursine sat on the central platform and kept track on bone tags. She'd come up with this herself. 1 tag per sponge, a notch for every fruit harvested. Dorian looked at her system and said that she'd invented this accounting method in 2 days, whereas it had taken the House of Vex 200 years to do so. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. The second wave. The fruits. 1,000 people walked around the ring and harvested. Dorian established a rule. Each sponge should be checked on the 7th day, not the 11th. He said there should always be a reserve because people make mistakes, but mushrooms don't. The crates were stacked on a dry patch beneath the armored ones. By the 5th day, there were 2,100 fruits lying there. The third wave, the armored ones. Dorian took the 2 remaining seeds and planted them by the rampart. A day later, he harvested 8 from them. 2 days later, the 8 had become 32. They set out at dawn, and it was no column. It was a snake. 210 people in tar-coated cloaks walked in single file, carrying crates of armored plant seeds on their backs. Each carried exactly 1 crate, and each crate contained 2 seeds. Dorian walked first and carried 8. Urson walked second. Gruel brought up the rear and made sure no one fell behind. They reached the rampart in 6 hours without stopping. Dorian climbed onto the rampart, looked east, and said that the chain began here. He explained it again, speaking slowly. He said that the rampart was the 0 circle. He said that the first armored warrior stood 120 paces away and the second 206 paces away, and that beyond that, the area was empty. He said that starting from the second circle, he would go to plant the seeds, and that each new sear represents a day's growth. He said that while a circle is growing, a person stands in the previous one, waiting and not moving. He said that 210 people meant 210 circles. He said that if each circle was 41 paces, the chain would stretch for 8,600 paces. He said that it was 4,100 paces to the source. He said that they had twice as many people as needed, but no time to spare. Gruel asked how much time. Dorian said that 100 circles per day meant 100 days, and that they didn't have any. He said that's why they wouldn't wait. He explained the fan formation. He said that the armored plant produces 4 seeds every other day. He said that if he planted 1 bush, he'd have 4 seeds the next day and could plant 4 bushes, but they'd all be in the same spot, which would be useless. He said that instead, he would move forward in a chain and plant all 4 at different distances. He said the first one 41 steps ahead, the second 82, the third 123, the fourth at 164. He said that all 4 grow for 1 day at the same time. He said that after 1 day, he'd immediately have 4 circles in a row, 164 steps ahead, and 16 seeds. He said that after 2 days, that would be 656 steps and 64 seeds. Iris N went back along the chain an hour later, and Dorian heard her passing his words along the circles and how they traveled from person to person all the way to the rampart. 8 hours later, the first crate of fruit reached him along the chain. It was carried 1 circle at a time. A man would grab the crate, take a breath, run 41 steps, pass it to the next circle, and fall to catch his breath. Dorian kept track of the time. 80 circles from the rampart to his position. The crate had been traveling for 8 hours. He calculated ahead. When the chain stretched to 4,000 steps, the crates would take a full day to reach him. He committed this to memory and moved on. On the second day, he planted 16 seeds. He walked forward, planting 1 every 41 steps, and on every 4th step, he stopped and split open a fruit. He walked 656 steps, then stood at the end and waited. Behind him, the chain crept along in his wake. People ran for 9 seconds, from circle to circle, falling, gasping for breath, getting back up and running again. By the end of the second day, they had covered 600 steps and hadn't lost a single one. On the third day, everything broke down. Dorian planted 64 seeds and walked 2,600 steps, which took him 11 hours of darkness and 40 fruits, and he emerged into the final circle empty and on all fours. He lay in the mud, and the line flashed red. Limit exceeded. Carrier depleted. He raised his head and heard a scream behind him. It was far away. He walked along the chain from circle to circle, losing his words, and a fragment reached Dorian. The circles are breaking. Dorian forced himself to stand up. He walked back along the chain. He passed through 9 circles and saw it. The armored one in the 10th circle was dead. It stood there, black and dry. Its shell collapsed, and there was nothing in the circle but blackness. Behind it, in the next circle, 3 sat. And they could not get out because it was now 82 steps to the rampart, not 41. Dorian looked at the dead bush. The line said, Quagmire Armored Beetle. Age, 3 days. External pressure critical. Shell destroyed. Dorian counted, his expression unchanged. The armored beetle lives for 3 days in the rot, not 11, like a sponge. 3. The first circles were planted 3 days ago. That means the entire rear section of the chain is starting to die right now. That means the road behind him is crumbling at the same rate it's being built ahead. He stood there and realized he hadn't built a road. He had built a wave. It rolled forward, leaving nothing in its wake. He shouted across the dead circle, and they heard him. He told those in the rear to plant new seeds in the old circles. He said there would be enough seeds because each bush yields 4, and only 1 is needed. He said the circle should be replanted on the second day, not the third. He said that anyone could do it because you could stand and work inside a clear circle. He explained this 3 times, and each time the message traveled back through the chain, and he heard it fade away. 6 hours later, the answer came. Dorian sat on the edge of the clear circle and stared at the tree for 4 hours without approaching it. Irsen sat next to him. Her back was scorched, and she remained silent. Dorian spoke aloud, not to her, but to himself, and she listened. He said it was the same machine. He said that the catching sponge draws poison from the air and stores it in the fruit, and that if the fruit isn't picked, it hardens, and the sponge withers and dies in 11 days. He said that the tree has been drawing poison from the ground for 411 years, storing it in the trunk and expelling it through the bark. He said that the outlet is blocked. He said it was the same stone fruit, only as heavy as a mountain. He stood up and walked closer. The line updated. Fruit chamber, 100% full. Pressure critical. Bark permeability at 11% of normal. Dorian read the last line and stopped. 11%. He walked all the way around the tree, which took him half an hour because the trunk was like a hill. He looked at the bark. It wasn't white, it was covered with a crust, black, hard, and as thick as a palm. He scraped at it with a knife, but it wouldn't give way. He struck it with the handle, and the sound was like hitting stone. Dorian crouched down and realized the tree had been excreting poison through its bark for 400 years. The poison had settled on the outer bark. It had hardened, layer upon layer. Over 400 years, the tree had become overgrown with its own exhaust. It was suffocating in what it had exhaled. He went back to Irsen and told her. She asked about the threads. Dorian said that the threads were the last resort. He said that when the outlet became blocked, the pressure inside the trunk began to rise. He said that the tree started looking for another way out. He said that it sent out the threads so they could find a clean place to discharge the poison. He said that the threads went into the quagmire and found the swamp dwellers. He said that a thread enters a person and releases the pressure into them, and the person dies within a day, and that's 1 drop. He said that 6,000 swamp dwellers meant 6,000 drops, and that the tree still hadn't relieved the pressure, He said it had been dying for 2 years now and couldn't even die properly. Irsen asked what would happen when it burst. Dorian looked at the trunk. He said there were 400 years worth of buildup inside it. He said that all the rot was just the 11% that had seeped through the bark. He said that 89% was inside. He said that if the trunk burst, as much would come out in a single day as had flowed for 400 years. He said it would cover the bog in an hour and the causeway in 3, and that he hadn't calculated beyond that, because it didn't matter. Irsen asked what to do. Dorian didn't answer. He sat there staring at the tree. It inhaled and exhaled, and the interval was 26 seconds. He sat there until dark. Then he said there were 3 options, and they were all bad. He stated the first one, kill it. He said that if they killed the tree, the trunk would burst open immediately and everything would come pouring out at once. And that was the worst thing they could do. He said that for 400 years, no one had ever reached it, and that was the only reason the swamp was still intact. He said that if any of those who had tried had made it and struck it with a spear, this land would no longer exist. He mentioned the second option, to leave. He said that in 6 days it would burst on its own, and that they would have time to lead the tribe to the causeway. He said that 3,000 swamp dwellers on the causeway are 3,000 targets for the tower. He said that even if the tower lets them through, they'll be killed beyond the causeway. He said that even if they aren't killed, the wave will catch up to them in 3 hours. He said that this isn't an option. It's a way to die of exhaustion. Irsen asked about the third one. Dorian was silent for a long time. Then he said that the third option was to harvest the fruit. Irsen didn't understand. Dorian explained. He said that the sponge swells when the fruit is overfilled and that if you harvest the fruit, the sponge moves on. He said that the tree is a sponge and that it has a single fruit weighing as much as a mountain and that it cannot be harvested. He said there was another way. He said you could open the outlet. He said that if you scrape off the bark, the tree will release everything it has accumulated, unburden itself, and move on. Irsen said that then everything would come out. Dorian said yes. He said the difference was in the speed. He said that if the trunk burst, everything would come out in a day. He said that if you open the bark, it would come out through the bark at a normal rate. He said that the normal rate is what has been flowing for 400 years. He said that if they restore 100% instead of 11, the tree will expel what it has accumulated over about 40 years. Irsen said, 40 years of poison. Dorian said, yes. He said that for 40 years, the quagmire would be poisoned 9 times more intensely than it is now. He said that the entire outer bog would turn to rot. He said that the settlement would rot away in a month. He fell silent. Irsen said that in that case, this wasn't an option either. Dorian said it was an option. He said they had a sponge. He stood up. He spoke quickly and without pausing, and Irsen listened without interrupting. He said that the capture sponge extracts from the air with 91% efficiency and stores it in the fruit. He said that one sponge cleans 11 meters. He said that in a month there would be 1,300 of them. He said that if you cut open the tree's bark, the poison would seep out, and if there were a field of sponges surrounding the tree, they would absorb it. He said that then there would be no poisoning. There would be a harvest. He gave figures. He said the tree had accumulated toxins over 400 years. He said that if the yield exceeded 40, that would be 10 times more per year than it is now. He said that right now, a single sponge produces 60 fruits in 9 days from ordinary fog. He said that near the trunk, it would produce 10 times as many. He said 600 fruits from a sponge in 9 days. He said that 1,300 sponges around the trunk would yield 800,000 fruits every 9 days. He paused. He did the math in his head and gave the final figure. He said that's 9 million ounces of concentrate per year, 91% pure. He said that the entire House of Vec hadn't produced that much in 200 years. Irsen looked at him and didn't move. Dorian said that for 400 years, this land had been worthless. He said it was worthless because it contained too much poison. Dorian stood there with the knot and the seed in his hands and didn't confirm it. Urson looked at his face and didn't understand what was happening, because only he could see the line. He said the number aloud to her. He said that the crossbreeding yield was 81% and that he had 19. She asked what would happen. Dorian said he would stop. She asked if he was sure. He said he didn't know. He said this was the first time the expenditure had exceeded the balance, and that before he'd lost 11, 19, and 23, and had failed every time. He said that 81 wasn't a drop. He sat right down in the mud at the edge of the clean area, holding the seed and the knot, and thought. Urson sat across from him and didn't interrupt. Dorian looked for another way for 40 minutes. He counted aloud, and she listened, though she didn't understand half of it. He said they could try without crossing. He said we could take a bare knot of thread and press it against the bark to see if it would go inside. He said it wouldn't. He said the thread goes toward the clean part, but inside the trunk it's not clean. It's concentrate. He said the thread had been running out of the trunk its whole life, and that it wouldn't crawl back in. He said we needed a thread that doesn't go toward the clean part, but toward the dirty part. He said there isn't one like that. He said there's a sponge that goes into the dirty part because it eats it. He said the sponge can't pass through the bark. He said you need both, and that this is what cross-pollination is, and that there's no way around it. He fell silent. Then he said, we could wait. He said the life force is regenerating. Urson asked how quickly. Dorian said he didn't know because it had never recovered before. He said that over the past 18 days, it had only been depleting. He said that if it worked like tissue, it would take hours. He said that if it worked differently, it would take years. He said he had 6 days and no time to check. He looked at the tree. It inhaled and exhaled, and the interval was 24 seconds. Urson said they could send for someone. Dorian asked who. She said she didn't know. He said there was only one talent, and that it was within him, and that there was no one to pass it on to. He said it was the only thing that couldn't be grown on this earth. Then he said a third thing, and it was the last thing he could think of. He said it could be broken into pieces. He said that if the crossbreeding cost 81, then maybe it could be done in 2 passes of 40 each. He said he didn't know if it was possible. He tried. He brought his hands together, and the line flashed. He tried to confirm it halfway, but the line didn't change. 81% consumption. Confirm. He lowered his hands. He said it wasn't possible. Urson was silent for a long time. Then she said one thing, and she said it calmly. She said that if he didn't do it, everyone would die in 6 days. She said there were 3,000 in the settlement and 210 in the chain, plus her, Gruel, and Branch. She said she wouldn't try to persuade him because persuading someone to die was despicable. She said she was just giving him the numbers because he liked them. Dorian looked at her. Then he said she didn't understand. He said he wasn't afraid. He said that wasn't the point. He said that if he stopped now, the tree would be opened, the tribe would survive, Kern would take the fruit, and everything would work for a month. He said that in a month, the sponges in the ring would overflow and rise up, and the threads would go after the people. He said that in 11 days, the ring would fall apart if no one walked through it. He said they know how to walk. Then he said that in 2 months, the armored creatures by the warehouse would die, the warehouse would get wet, and 2,000 fruits would rot. He said that no one but him knows this. He said that in half a year, the Vex would arrive, and they'd have to negotiate with them, and that Kern would sell them out on the very first day, unless there was someone nearby who knew the numbers better than Kern. He said he wasn't the only one who could live here. He was the only one who could keep it going. He said that if he were to die, everything he'd grown would die within a year. He said the land would return to the very place from which he'd pulled it out, and that it would happen just a little slower than a tree, and that's all. Urson listened without interrupting. Urson held his head on her lap for 11 hours, and Dorian spent the entire time looking at the tree and counting. He couldn't speak and couldn't move, but he could count, and he counted every breath. 26, 28, 31, 34. The root thread crept along the root and along the bark, and its offshoots spread upward and to the sides, and from each piece of bark it slid off in layers and fell downward, shattering on the ground. By 6 o'clock, the lower third of the trunk was bare and white, and black smoke rose from it in a solid wall. It rose upward and was carried westward, disappearing into rot. By 11 o'clock, the thread had reached the crown. Dorian saw how it rose 40 roasts high, and how its offshoots spread across the entire surface, and how the bark began to fall from the entire trunk at once. It fell in chunks the size of a house. The ground shook. Gruel reached them by evening. He had walked the entire 200 circles of the chain and run half of them, and Dorian heard him fall nearby and ask Irsen what was wrong with him. Irsen said she didn't know. Gruel lifted Dorian into his arms like a child, and Dorian felt nothing. The line hung before him and didn't change. Life force, 0%. Then it changed. Dorian read it and couldn't believe it. Carrier. External source detected. Critical concentration of swamp poison. Absorption. He lay in Gruel's arms, 8 paces from the tree trunk from which a wall of black smoke was billowing, and his body was devouring that smoke. The reading changed. Vitality, 1%. Dorian closed his eyes for the first time in 11 hours. He had been lying in the black smoke for a full day. Gruel and Irsen sat nearby in their pitch-black cloaks, burning fruits to breathe and stay alive. By the end of the first day, Dorian was able to move his fingers. By the end of the second, he sat up. The display read 19%. He looked at the tree and didn't recognize it. It stood bare and white, stripped of everything. It was breathing steadily. The interval was 41 seconds. Dorian sat and listened to it, and then spoke his first word in 2 days. He said it had stabilized. The display confirmed it. The bark's throughput was 94%. Accumulation halted. Degradation halted. Dorian did the math in his head, and his expression didn't change. 94. He said aloud that the input was 100 and the output was 94, and that it was still accumulating at a rate of 6% per year. He said that meant 1,000 years instead of 6 days. He said that would be enough. Gruel asked about the thread. Dorian looked at the white sprout twining around the trunk. The line said its viability was 9 days. He said that it would die in 9 days, and that the bark would start to grow back. He said that in 9 days it would grow by 0.002%. He said that the tree needed to be cleaned once every 20 years, and that this required one person with talent, and that there was only one such talent, and it was in him. He fell silent. Then he said that in 20 years he would figure out how to do it without himself. He said he had 20 years. He said this was the first time he'd ever had time. They had been leaving rottenness for 4 days, and the chain coiled behind them like a rope. 210 people walked back in circles, and in each circle the last person pulled out an armored plant by the roots and carried it along. Dorian had ordered this. He said the armored plants would still be useful and that nothing should be left behind. They emerged onto the rampart, and Dorian turned and looked at the black wall. It stood there. He said it would stand for another 40 years and that it wouldn't go anywhere. He said that now it simply wasn't growing. The settlement greeted them in silence. 3,000 people stood on the bridges and watched. Vetivi was waiting on the central platform, and he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was Hald Kern, and next to Kern were 12 carts. Kern looked at Dorian, at his translucent skin, and at the way he was being supported by the arms. He said he had been waiting for 16 days. He said he had taken 480 fruits and taken them beyond the pier, and that he had sold 11 of a single apothecary as a sample. He fell silent. Dorian asked, "And then what?" Kern said that the apothecary had taken everything he had and asked for more. He said the pharmacist asked where they came from, and that he hadn't said. He said that within 11 days the rumor had spread through 3 cities on its own. He said that yesterday 4 men came to him, and they all asked the same thing. He said that a 5th man came to him yesterday as well. Dorian asked who. Kern said the man was from the Wex household. There was a long silence. Kern said the man had given a name. He said it was Castle Vex. He said the eldest son had come in person, and that he hadn't asked about the fruit. He'd asked about the 3rd son. Dorian stood there, holding onto Gruel's shoulder to keep from sitting down. He asked what Kern had said. Kern looked at him, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and held it out.
He said he hadn't said anything. He said he'd taken the letter and brought it. Dorian unfolded the sheet. He read it for a long time. Then he folded it back up and read aloud what was written there. He said it stated that House Vex knew he was alive. He said it stated that House Vex knew about the mushrooms. He said it stated that House Vex was offering him a chance to return.
He said it stated that the charge of stealing the heart of P would be dropped, that the court would acknowledge its mistake, and that his name would be cleared. He said it stated that in return, he would hand over to House Vex everything he had grown, that House Vex would take control of the quagmire, and that the swamp dwellers would be given work. He fell silent. Gruel asked what his answer would be. Dorian looked at the letter in his hand, and then at the ring of 31 sponges surrounding the settlement, and at the people on the bridges, and then at Kern. He said one thing. He asked Kern how much purified poison House Vex had sold last year. Kern said about 40,000 ounces. Dorian asked at what price. Kern said 1 silver per ounce. Dorian said, "So that's 40,000 in silver." He turned to Irson and asked how many fruits were currently in stock. She said 2,900. Dorian counted aloud. He said that was 31,900 ounces at 91% purity. He said that, based on the dosage calculation, that amounted to 64,000 ounces of Vex's product. He said they had more in the warehouse right now than Vex's company had produced in a year. He said the warehouse had filled up in 9 days. He said it matter-of-factly, and everyone stood there in silence. Then Dorian tore up the letter. He didn't tear it to shreds. He tore it in half, dropped it into the black water, and watched it sink. He said he wouldn't respond. Kern asked why. Dorian said that you answered the one who asked the question. He said that Dom Vex hadn't asked a question. Dom Vex had made an offer. He said that offers are made to those who are weaker. He raised his left hand and showed his wrist. It was clean. No stripes, no circle. He said that 18 days ago he'd been thrown out here because he was worthless. He said that now they were offering to restore his name. He said that a name was worth less than a single box. He turned to Kern and said that now he would speak about business. He spoke for an hour and no one interrupted him. He said the first thing. He said that Kern would get the right to transport the goods and no one else. He said that in return, Kern wouldn't pay in silver. He'd pay in a share. He said that Kern's share was 11% and the tribe's share was 89%. Kern said that was robbery. Dorian said that was the price for being the only one who'd come here on his own. Kern laughed and agreed. Dorian made a second point. He said that the tribe doesn't sell the fruit. The tribe sells ounces. He said that the fruit is raw material, and that raw material is bought for copper. He said that they pay silver for an ounce of concentrate. He said they would crack open the fruits and bottle the concentrate right here themselves. He said they'd need barrels for that, and that Kern would bring the barrels with the very first shipment. Kern said House Vex would kill them for that. Dorian said that House Vex had kept the recipe a closely guarded secret for 200 years so that no one could bottle it themselves. He said they no longer needed the recipe because they were growing it themselves. He said the House of Vex wouldn't kill them for bottling it. The House of Vex would kill them simply for existing. He said it was already a done deal and that the barrels wouldn't change that. He said a third thing, and that was the most important part. He said that in a month they'd have 1,300 sponges. He said that in 3 months, 40,000. He said he wasn't going to sell it all. He said they'd keep half. Kern asked why. Dorian said that in 6 months, an epidemic would strike. Kern froze. Dorian said he didn't know what kind or where it would come from. He said he knew arithmetic. He said that poison had been accumulating in the tree in this land for 400 years, and that now it was flowing out in a steady stream, and that the land around it would change. He said that this entire land was a vast experiment that had been running unattended for 400 years. He said that the threads had emerged from the tree 2 years ago, and that the threads were the first thing to come out of it, and that they had killed 6,000 people in 2 years without anyone behind the dam even noticing. He said that the threads had been contained because the tree was holding them back. He said that now the tree is open and that everything will come out of it. He said he didn't know what. He said he only knew that it would come out, and that the only cure for everything that grows in this land grows in this very land. He said that's how it always works. Branch said one thing quietly. He asked if that meant the quagmire was now dangerous for everyone. Rian said yes. He said that for 400 years, the quagmire had been a pit where exiles were dumped, and that everyone considered it the edge of the world. He said it wasn't the edge. It was a cauldron with a lid. He said that the lid had been removed the day before yesterday, and that he was the one who had removed it. He said that now everything that had been simmering inside the cauldron would spill out. He said that the first thing to come out would be poison, and that they already knew how to collect it. He said that the second thing to come out would be something he hadn't seen yet. He said that for this, he needed all the sponges they would grow, the entire warehouse, the whole tribe, and all of Rot. He said he would grow a cure for what hadn't started yet, and that he wouldn't wait for it to begin. Urson asked how he knew he'd make it in time. Dorian said he didn't know. He said he had a talent for crossbreeding, and that he had land where everything was already poisoned, and that it was the best place in the world to look for a cure. He said that beyond the causeway, people have clean land and clean water, and that they don't know a single disease of this place. He said that when the first one comes, they'll be dead within a month. He said that here, the swamp dwellers live 400 years in poison, and that they've already endured everything this land has thrown at them. He said this last part, and he said it loudly so that all 3,000 could hear. He said that beyond the causeway, people think this place is nothing but trash and rot. He said that beyond the causeway, they're right. He said that this place is trash. He said that in a year, everyone will come for this trash and stand by the tower, begging to be let in. He said that then the swamp dwellers will decide who to let in. The crowd was silent. Then Branch did a strange thing. He stepped down from the central platform, went down 2 steps, and stood on the bridge with everyone else. He said that he had been the chief for 61 years, and that the chief is the one who decides how to die. He said that now they had to decide how to live, and that he didn't know how to do that. He looked at Dorian and said that the tribe would follow whoever knew how to count. He didn't say the word ruler. There was no such word in the swamp. He simply stepped down 2 steps, and that was enough. Dorian didn't climb back up onto the platform. He remained standing on the bridge where he was. He told Gruul that they needed 400 people for the landing and that they had to start tomorrow. He told Irson that they needed 20 people who knew how to count and that she would be the one to teach them. He told Kern that the barrels would be needed in 9 days. He kept assigning tasks for another hour, and no one left until he was finished. That night, he sat alone on the edge of the platform overlooking the black water. The ring stood in the fog. A fire burned in each clear circle, and people walked among them. 18 days ago, he had woken up in a cage, remembering nothing, and the first thing he saw were the bars. He raised his left hand and looked at his wrist. It was clean. He stared at it for a long time. Then he lowered his hand and took out of the bag the last thing that remained there. It was an ash bush seed, an ordinary one. First generation, the very same weed that grows from the black water and purifies the air to the length of a palm, and which, in the memory of the House of Vex, was listed as an indicator of dead earth. Dorian held it in the palm of his hand and looked at it. He thought about how, 18 days ago, he had crouched down next to that bush in the middle of the yellow fog, and how the line had told him that its effective radius was 11 centimeters and that it was useless. He thought about how nothing is ever useless. There are things that no one has looked at. He pressed the seed into the dirt right next to the stake. Then he stood up and went to sleep. He needed to get some rest. Work was starting in the morning.